So we are given a definition. The square root of negative be an imaginary number. So we're going to replace it anytime we come across the square root of -1 in our that with an I. I is not a variable because you can see right here it's defined to have a value, but it oftentimes behaves very much like a variable when we do the divide. But you will first run into it underneath the radical. That is means that we have an imaginary number. You'll see that on the graphing when we have parabolas that don't cross the x-axis. Well, they still have solutions. They're just going to be imaginary solutions. So that's when we run into negative radicands. So this negative simplifies this negative as a -1. And then the 9, of course, stays the 9. And then the square root of -1 is replaced with an I. And because we can take the square root of 9, we take the square root of 9, we get 3. And it's normal practice to put the coefficient in front of the I. On this one, however, when we take negative out, make it an I, the square root of 5 does not simplify, so we leave that term behind the I. So radicals go behind the I, or coefficients go in front of the I. Again, the square root of -80, take the negative out, it becomes an I. Simplify the 80 now, just like we did previously. 16 times 5, the square root of 16 is the 4. So the 4 goes in front of the I, and then the square root of 5, which was what was left, that stays behind the I. All exponents of i's will reduce down to one of these 4 values. So anytime you run into, because when we multiply, we're going to get I squares and I cubes and I to the 4th. When you get one of those, you're going to reduce them down to one of these values. So I to the 1st power is just like it was defined. It's the square root of -1. So the square root of -1 raised to the 1st power, that's just the square root of -1. So that's I. But if we take the square root of -1 and we square it, the square and the square root cancel out, leaving us with just the -1. So anytime we see I squared, we're going to replace that I squared with an I. Similar calculations are the result here. I know you don't really care about that, so just memorize that I cubed is -I and I to the 4th is 1. So these are and all other powers always reduce down to these same 4. So I to the 9th would be I to the 10th would be -1, I to the 11th would be I to the 12th would be 1. So it just keeps going in a cycle. These are the only ones that you'll need to remember. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, maybe the 4th, probably just the 1st, 2nd, 3rd. So when you multiply, this is where it behaves like a variable. 4i times 7i, multiply the 4 and the 7 together, 28. I to the 1st times I to the 1st becomes I to the 2nd. You add the exponents, and then I squared, use this substitution from right here, replace the I squared with a -1. Positive 28 times -1 becomes -28. -4 times +2 becomes -8. I times I becomes I squared. Replace the I squared with the -1. -8 times -1 becomes +8. If you have negatives underneath the radicals, just like we did on the previous page or the previous lesson, you take the negative out as an I. The negative comes out as an I, and then 18 factors into 9 times 2. We want to do that because the square root of 9 becomes a 3. So the square root of -18 eventually becomes 3i square roots of 2. The square root of 10, just the negative comes out as an I, so it's just I square roots of 10. Now we have outside things that we're going to multiply, and then we have inside things that we're going to multiply. 3i times 1i is 3i squared. Root 2 times root 10 is root 20. Replace the I squared with the -1, that's from right here. And then factor the 20, that's 4 times 5. We want to do that, so we can take the square root of 4, that becomes 2. Remember, there was already a -3, out in front. So multiply the 2 from the square root of 4, multiply that times the -3 that was already out there. That becomes -6. -6 root 5. And this one over here, each one of these negatives become out as an I. And then I can simplify the 24. 4 times 6, remove the 4, becomes a 2 on the outside. And I've got 2i times I times I. 2i times I times I. 3 i's will give me I cubed. Go back up here, see that I cubed is negative I. So this 2 is now, instead of being multiplied times I cubed, is multiplied by negative I. And the square root of 36 is 6. So we've got to multiply these three things together. We get 2 times 6 is 12. The negative makes it a negative 12i.